Well, hello, it's Scotland at 7, and this is Wednesday, the 19th of January. So I'm Hugh Stewart, and I'm in the Glasgow studio. And joining us tonight from Kirriemuir, I believe that's right, is Ruth Watson. Is that where you are, Ruth? I should have checked.
Yes, it is indeed.
Yes.
Hi, Hugh.
Okay, hi. So we'll discuss the headlines tonight in a couple of minutes, Ruth, after I've had a look at the coronavirus numbers for Scotland. So as of 2 p.m. today, there are 8,495 new infections, including cases identified using either a first LFD test or a PCR positive test. There are 29 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 10,122. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,571 were in hospital last night, 44 of whom were in intensive care. As of 7:30 today, 7:30 a.m., 4,401,876 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 4,092,558 have received their second dose, and 3,223,113 have received the third dose, or their booster. The latest UK daily figures show 152,872 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 359 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. Well, Ruth, our first story tonight concerns the Red Wall, the writing on the Tory Red Wall, because Tory MP Christian Wakeford has defected to Labour, piling more pressure on Boris Johnson as growing numbers within his own party call on the Prime Minister to resign. Just minutes before Prime Minister's questions today, Mr Wakeford, elected as the MP for Bury South in 2019, crossed the floor to sit with Keir Starmer's party, declaring in a letter to Johnson resigning the Conservative whip that he, Johnson, was incapable of offering the leadership and government this country deserves. The move will prove a huge embarrassment for Boris Johnson, who's fighting to avoid enough of his own backbenchers submitting letters of no confidence. 54 of these are required to trigger a ballot. Many of those who have written a letter are members of the 2019 intake, like Mr Wakeford, who submitted his letter last week. In a letter to the Prime Minister released this afternoon, Mr Wakeford said he believed the policies of the Conservative government that you lead are doing nothing to help the people of my constituency, and indeed are only making the struggles they face daily worse. Raising concerns about the cost of living crisis and how the country should emerge from the COVID pandemic, Mr Wakeford said that the UK needed a government that upholds the highest standards of integrity and probity in public life. He added, sadly, both you and the Conservative Party as a whole have shown themselves incapable of offering the leadership that the leadership and the government that this country deserves. Okay, so that's Mr Wakeford, a brick out of the Red Wall. Now, what do you think are the kind of policies that his constituents need? And are those the kind of policies that Mr Wakeford has been voting for in his 2 years in Parliament?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, this is a man who's voted with the government, as if memory serves, for such things as, refusing free school meals to children in need and removing the £20 universal credit, £20 universal credit uplift. So one suspects that actually Mr Wakeford is more driven by self-interest. The thought of losing his job, I think, when the next general election comes along. There's a number of things that it raises for me, one of which it's always a delight to see the not entirely pleasant Mr Bowie's face collapse as it did on Politics Live when he went from going, nah, he's my mate, he wouldn't do that, to honestly, I've never seen the man look so gutted. It was actually, it gave me a small frisson, I have to say. But sort of, the comedic aspect aside of watching somebody you don't respect fall on their face, it's for Johnson to be losing first the Scottish MPs and MSPs, well, one Scottish MP, but the Scottish wing of the UK Conservative Party. They like to call themselves the Scottish Conservatives, but they are just Conservatives in Scotland. But I mean, even that's interesting to see the way that this is playing out up here, because you've got, Professor Tompkins, former Tory MSP, saying that he thinks that basically the Conservative Party in Scotland should be independent of the Conservative Party in Westminster, which is something many of us have been trying to tell him for a long time. And that there's another. Let's take it a little bit further, shall we? But watching what's happening around Johnson, watching the not just being stabbed in the back, but actually being held to account, but by a small minority of people. He purged most of the old grandees and those. The Conservative Party no longer is the broad church of conservatism with a small c. They got rid of everybody that had that view in the last, Dominic Grieve and those Conservatives of that sort that I still didn't agree with, but at least I had a chance of being able to respect in some aspects. Many odious policies, but you could almost kind of go, okay, well, at least he's being honest or she's being honest to their viewpoint. This lot just seemed to be extremely opportunistic. And this, in some ways, depresses me. Sort of this, Christian Wakeford crossing the field, crossing over to Labour. It depresses me for a couple of reasons. He didn't stop supporting Boris Johnson when it meant children going to school hungry. He stopped supporting Boris Johnson when he thought he might be ousted from his seat by his electorate. And there's another thing which is really depressing, which is, when did it happen? How did it happen that the Labour Party has gone so far to the right that a Tory can just cross over and sit within their ranks? Usually in the old days, they might have taken a circuitous route via the Lib Dems. You know what I mean? I don't like to sort of fall into sort of easy phraseology, but it just, I sometimes feel like we're outside the Manor Farm with Orwell's sort of Orwell's farm animals looking in and watching the pigs and the men and the men and the pigs. It's quite depressing, although it is a delight to watch.
So it's getting hard to tell the Labour from the Tory and the Tory from the Labour. I wonder what effect this is going to have on the possibility of a no confidence vote against the Prime Minister. Of course, we don't know how many letters have been written to Sir Graham Davy, that's his job. But presumably, if Mr. Wakeford wrote a letter last week, presumably that letter now can get thrown in the bin because he's not in the party any longer. But do you think this will have an effect of strengthening the backbone of the Tory MPs? Do you think this will actually play in favour of Johnson?
Well, it's one of those things when you sort of get into the nerdosphere of politics. Watching all the political pundits actually having one of the best days of their careers today. You know what I mean? Woohoo! Something's actually happening that we can talk about. That's not just about sort of Carrie Antoinette and her wallpaper. It's some of them are saying that actually they think this will have the opposite effect. That watching one of their colleagues cross the House might actually stop people in their tracks and go, hang on a second, perhaps the damage we're doing with this infighting is going to be so cumulative that it might kind of have a huge effect. I am hearing sort of, Beth Rigby, who's been extremely good. She's got a fantastic manner. She was saying earlier on Sky News that some MPs now are asking for their letters back. There's other news that reports that sort of some of the thugs are standing outside Brady's door, so the 1922 committee, refusing to let people in to hand in letters. So who knows what the truth of it all is, and who knows if we'll ever find out what the truth of it all is. But the thing is, Boris is a man who got Brexit done. I accept it hasn't happened, and what has happened is a catastrophe. And we've got March coming up. There's already problems, again, further problems happening. The economy's tanking. And I think it's the 1st of March. In March, we've got the phytosanitary regulations coming in, which mean it's going to be even harder to get foods coming in from the continent, and seeds, and getting our stuff out. So there's a huge
So,
economic hit coming, and perhaps they don't want to be left holding that particularly ugly baby.
yes, who in fact wants to take on that poison chalice? Yes, so it could well be that people are saying, "Yeah, you did this, so you can take responsibility for it." To Prime Minister Johnson.
Well, I think perhaps Johnson was always going to be the Putz.
Yep,
You
I
know, I
mean,
mean, I
as
think
we
I think
know,
that perhaps he was always the Putz.
it's
But he's such a Putz, he didn't care.
and well, no, yes, as Ed Miliband once famously said, ironically, we know you're a details man, so it's quite possible that Prime Minister Johnson didn't really go into the detail of what was in the agreement he was signing. Now, somebody else who maybe didn't go into the detail was his first Brexit secretary, David Davis, who, of course, looked at the job and decided it wasn't for him. So today, Mr. Davis, of course, has made a famous statement. Well, he's repeated a famous statement in the House of Commons. Let's go over this story. Prime Minister's questions earlier today. In the House of Commons, Prime Minister Johnson defended his record as he faced tough questions on the number 10 lockdown parties from opposition and from some Conservative MPs. Starting the session of Prime Minister's questions, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer welcomed Christian Wakeford, whom we've just discussed, the right-wing Conservative MP for Bury, who switched to the Labour Party today. Sir Keir pressed the Prime Minister on his carefully rehearsed answers, wondering if they were prepared by a lawyer. The Prime Minister continued with the line that all will be clear when Sue Gray releases her report. For the SNP, Ian Blackford, the Westminster Party leader, said that the Prime Minister was pathetic and was laughing at the British public. The Prime Minister appeared uninterested, looking at his watch while Mr. Blackford questioned him, concluding by saying that this Prime Minister isn't fit for office. Later, Stephen Flynn, the SNP member for Aberdeen South, asked the Prime Minister, is he getting rid of the COVID rules simply because he doesn't understand them? Perhaps the toughest comment for the Prime Minister came from the backbenches behind him when David Davis MP, the former Brexit negotiator, rose to his feet.
The economy moving.
David Davis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many on these benches, I spent weeks and months defending the Prime Minister against often angry constituents. I've reminded them of his success in delivering Brexit and on the vaccine and many other things. But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
In the name of God, go. Now, as Davis said, that was in fact, those are orders of Conservative MP Leo Amery in 1940. Now, the interesting thing here is about Prime Minister Johnson's reply. Now, those words are very well known, in the name of God, go. And in fact, Amery himself was quoting Oliver Cromwell, who said the same thing somewhat earlier in 1653. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done in the name of God, go. That's paraphrasing Cromwell. But in reply, the Prime Minister, who has written a biography of Churchill, said that he did not know what Mr. Davis was talking about. Now, that's hardly credible, is it? This is the famous phrase which really precipitated Churchill into power at the start of World War II. And Johnson has written a biography of Churchill, but he stands up in Parliament and says, I don't know what you're talking about. Why does he say things like this? He's obviously talking rubbish.
Yeah, he is. I mean, I guess in some respects, perhaps our current Prime Minister is so used to deflection and denial that that's his first instinct. I don't know what you're talking about, what rubbish. I mean, I guess, although I do have, never let it be said I've ever stood up for Boris Johnson, but in this instance, I actually think that this is one of his lesser, you can understand him being it being equivalent to saying, "Oh, what utter nonsense! Oh, what tosh!" So I don't think that it was quite saying, to say I don't know what the man is talking about is not the same as to say I've never heard that quotation before. And so in a semantic jousting match, I think that perhaps Johnson just found himself without his usual ability to descend into half mangled Greek quotes. Um, but I think that that's it. I mean, that's as far as I'm prepared to let the man off with it, because obviously what struck me more about that was the obvious fulminating incandescence that you could see in David Davis's face. Now, David Davis is a man that I just I can't say enough about, that I would bore your listeners um, just saying how angry the man makes me. But for all that I don't like him, I don't like his policies, I don't ever think I've had cause to doubt that the terrible Brexit he has forced on Scotland, he has helped force on Scotland, has been something that he genuinely wanted and genuinely thought that it was going to be a good thing. I don't think that he's like the Rees-Moggs who wanted Brexit because he thought he could make money out of it. I think that David Davis is one of those insular people who genuinely thought that there would be sunlit up plans. And perhaps for somebody who has spent 20 or 30 years campaigning for something, to see it descend into such an abomination as most of
Yeah.
Scotland knew was going to be the case, and but I think that David Davis is, he once did stand for party leader, to see somebody of Johnson's character in a seat that he once coveted. David Davis is the kind of person who is about Queen. He is about country. All of this stuff is the kind of stuff that, I mean, he probably, says his prayers and kisses a photo of the Queen before he goes to bed at night. You know what I mean? So all of this is the kind of stuff that I can imagine actually he does feel it. I suspect he genuinely and sincerely feels the rage. And you could see the disgust in his face as he
So
spoke about
you
Johnson.
mean so some of the old Tories, particularly old military types like Davis, maybe say, to use a Tory sort of expression, Johnson's just a bad sort, and bad piece of work. Maybe that's what's behind it. Also, Johnson
Well,
was
yeah.
clearly blindsided. He didn't see that coming, did he? So maybe that's why he hastily made an obviously mendacious answer. So we'll move on anyway, because I expect we'll be hearing more about how many letters have been written to Graham Brady. I think I misnamed him earlier on, but that'll come out with the Sue Gray report sometime in about a week, I think. The other story we're going to move on to now is that Boris Johnson, of course, has announced the end of all COVID measures introduced to combat the Omicron variant, including compulsory mask wearing on public transport and in shops, and guidance to
And
work
in
from home,
schools.
and vaccine certificates. So all that comes in from next week in England. The Prime Minister told the Commons that the legal requirement on people with coronavirus to self-isolate will be allowed to lapse when the regulations expired on the 24th of March, and that date could be brought forward. To cheers from some on the Conservative benches, Mr Johnson also announced an immediate end to the need for pupils to wear masks at secondary schools. Again, this refers to England, of course. While Johnson's statement will please a number of his backbenchers, it prompted concern from teaching and nursing unions, while one director of public health said the move felt motivated more by politics than evidence. Responding for Labour, Sir Keir Starmer said he would back the change as long as it was supported by evidence. The announcement comes in sharp contrast to the more cautious and more measured announcements by the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon in the Scottish Parliament yesterday. The same again applies to, as far as I know, to Wales. I don't know what the rules are in Northern Ireland, but I haven't heard of them being relaxed. So England is really going out on its own. As far as you've seen, do the COVID numbers justify relaxing, well, just removing all measures next week from England?
Today, the figures that we saw of deaths in England or the UK, it's the equivalent of, I think, a Boeing 380 falling out the sky and everyone being killed. And I mean, I just can't get my head around the kind of callousness, the kind of hubris, the kind of determination to get people back into into shops and into businesses. One, I presume, to try and, keep all those people who own the businesses and own the shops and own the premises, all those office premises are just sitting empty, that people perhaps are worrying about their investments. I can't help thinking that that this is about money rather than about people's well-being, and it terrifies me because people are dying. And those people, well, they're saying, well, Omicron, it's not as bad. Well, okay, fine, but because people are vaccinated and because we've got all these measures in place, people perhaps aren't dying in the terrifying numbers that they were before. But almost 400 souls have been lost in the last 24 hours. That's madness to think that it's okay to drop everything. I completely get the whole thing about, fine, let's open up a bit, but please keep masks in schools and in shops. And we can't go back to this endless cycle that there seems to be in England, where people go, everything's fine, Spitfires and Dame Vera Lynn, let's get out there, and then before you know it, everyone's being hauled back in. And the NHS in England is on its knees. You've got Sajid Javid talking about basically privatising it by the back door with this whole kind of grammar school concept for hospitals. And you just look at it and think, is there nothing that they will stop at to put money first? You've got the people of Tonga who have just endured a horrific natural disaster, talking about quarantining the aid that is being delivered to them so that COVID isn't introduced to their islands. And so they obviously know that they don't want to be getting it, and that they've got to be careful. And here you've got Johnson talking about people going back, being packed on the tube without masks again. It's utter folly.
Yep.
Criminal folly.
As you said, Ruth, yes, the numbers were almost 400 dead yesterday. That was throughout the UK, so that includes the Scottish numbers, and also over 400 yesterday. So that's where we are. Certainly, the Omicron.
It's a plane dropping out the.
Yes,
it's a plane dropping out the sky every day, and that's when you think about it in those terms. That's pretty shocking. That we will mourn the dead of a plane crash, quite rightly, for years to come, and yet somehow it's okay when it's being done so that people can go back to Wetherspoons.
Yes, it's just a British thing too. It's not as if it's a left-right thing. I mean, the Australian government is right-wing, but they took the opposite policy to the UK government. They said, well, we're an island, we'll try and stop it coming. If only Britain was an island, eh? Well, we must move on.
But I don't think it is a British thing, Hugh. I think that it is something which seems particular to the government of England. As Mark Drakeford said the other day, it is England that is the outlier. Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland are all maintaining a certain level of sensible precautions. So this is not a British thing. It is an English thing led by BAM pots in Westminster.
And you've just reminded me, yes, and we should, before we move on from that story, remind everyone that, yes, in Scotland, we still wear masks, but the government still asks us to wear masks on public transport and still reminds us to take a test, as we all do in the Broadcasting Scotland studios. We all took a negative test before we came today. So the health protection measures continue in Scotland. Our next story...
Don't forget to swab your throat as well.
Yes, of course, yeah.
For Omicron, because...
Yep, that's right.
Sorry, Hugh. The thing is that then it's very little talked about but I've been really struck. Linda Bald and Professor Devi Sridhar have been saying, the new little lateral flow test they've got this little dinky short thing that you're just supposed to put up your nose, but apparently Omicron bypasses that. So they ask people to kind of stick their hand in their throat and swab their throat, both tonsils as well, because the Delta, you could get away with the nose only, but with Omicron, they're saying please swab your throats as well.
I see. No, so I didn't know that. That's new to me. Thank you for pointing that out. Right, I didn't do that today. Okay. The SNP has today said that the Chancellor is failing to tackle the Tory cost of living crisis as inflation rose to 5.4%, the highest level since 1992. With the cost of living rising at its fastest pace in 30 years Alison Thewlis MP said the Chancellor must spend less time plotting his Tory leadership bid and more time delivering the urgent help families need to get through the months ahead. The SNP Shadow Chancellor called for an emergency package to boost household incomes, including reversing the Tory universal credit cuts, delivering a low-income energy payment, matching the Scottish Child Payment UK-wide, and introducing a real living wage. Commenting, Alison Thewlis, who is the Shadow Chancellor for the SNP, said, "While the UK government is all consumed by scandals, the Chancellor is failing to tackle the Tory cost of living crisis, and he is leaving millions of families in the lurch. The majority of families will be hundreds or thousands of pounds worse off this year as the result of Tory failure. Rishi Sunak must spend less time plotting his Tory leadership bid and more time delivering the urgent help families need to get through the months ahead." Now, Ruth, one thing that strikes me from this, the obvious struggle that a lot of people are feeling, which we reported on yesterday in fuel poverty, lots of people are seeing that something like a third or even a quarter for single families, a quarter or if single persons might have a half of their disposable income to spend on the fuel bills. That's really an indication of poverty. At the same time, Prime Minister Johnson earlier on today, in his bombast, he was saying, "We've abolished poverty. You've never had it so good," basically. So there are two different realities. There's Johnson's reality, the Tories are making things better, and the actual reality, which things are getting much worse. Is that why the Tories are so far behind the polls? That people know that things are getting worse, and his bombast isn't really making any difference?
I would really like to see, alongside people doing sign language interpretations for the deaf and hard of hearing at Westminster. I'd like to see that, and I would also like to see live fact checking happening, so that sort of you're getting. I think they tried. I think one of the news programs did try it, but it probably took too much time because there were so many lies unusually coming out from the government benches. I think today somebody said that they'd counted 7 untruths that came out from the Prime Minister's questions today. Just false assertions. Johnson, he throws them out there. It's like watching a gritter going past. Just kind of like the untruths and the kind of. Johnson's always wanted to be liked. He's made his living being the likable buffoon, unless you're one of his wives, in which case it kind of passes quite quickly. But I think that he's becoming increasingly desperate, and I think that there is a gulf between what people are prepared to believe now, because of the obvious lies. People can see the truth before them, and I think that this is a card that's being marked. And I think that Rishi Sunak, I was double checking my stats, but he wrote off £4.3 billion in fraudulent claims on COVID. He just kind of wrote them off. Well, that's fine. We're never going to get that back from businesses. And yet this is a man who wouldn't, pay £20 to people in need. So I think that there's a lot of people who bought. I've actually seen people being vox popped on some of the news, and there's been 2 or 3 folk have been allowed on the telly saying, sort of in the street being asked about it, and then they're saying, well, we thought he was a bit of a lad and we thought he was a bit of a laugh, but actually he's treating us like he treated all his former wives. He tells us what we want to hear, and then we wake up in the morning and kind of discover that it was all lies. And I think that people are waking up to that, but in the worst of ways. I know people who are terrified for the bills coming in. They're so worried that there's something that they're not going to be able to pay. One of my friends, she was telling me, and she works at a university, as a lecturer. She's got, she's on pretty good money, and she was telling me that she doesn't heat all the rooms in her house because she's a single parent and she's so worried. Well, if that's what somebody on a good salary is thinking, what is it going to be like for those folk who aren't getting by as it is? It's just that our local food bank. I mean, for goodness sake, how is it we live in a country that's got food banks? Our local food bank puts out appeals for meals that people can eat cold. Just sit in the middle of a Scottish winter and people are eating cold food because they can't afford to cook. Now that was happening before all this. It's just, it's hideous and it's horrific. The only light at the end of the tunnel for me is that if enough people see that callousness in politics can affect everybody, then perhaps they will demand a different kind of politics.
Now let's back that up with our next story. A new report by the Resolution Foundation has found that the UK government's welfare safety net is failing to fulfil the task it was created to do, to protect the poorest and those who find themselves out of work. The new data, which shows that financial support for people in the UK has not risen, comes as the UK government cost of living crisis continues. Commenting, the SNP's Work and Pension spokesperson David Linden MP said, SNP calls for improvements for a welfare system that meet the needs of people have been ignored by the Westminster government. It is now crystal clear that the only way to deliver a real safety net for people in Scotland is to become independent. This report lays bare that under successive Westminster governments, the UK welfare system no longer does what it's supposed to do, provide a safety net for people when circumstances suddenly change. So let's look at the Scottish element here for a minute. So first of all, well, to go back to the previous story, Alison Tholes has said Scotland has introduced a £20 child payment. So that's one thing. Why doesn't the UK government do that with that 4.3 billion that you mentioned earlier on that Rishi Sunak can afford to ignore? Well, let's just look at that first of all. Do you agree with the SNP that the Scottish government are taking measures? It's quite feasible for the UK government to do something along those lines?
Yes,
Okay.
of course. I mean, I think that the fact that the Scottish government, it's not just the SNP, but the Scottish government has put in place measures to try and address child poverty in particular, and to measures to support people who need personal care. There's a number of measures that have been taken, which people in England, I think, are quite shocked when they see the different kinds of governance that there is. It's one of those things. I occasionally see new Scots who've come up from England, English Scots, who are saying, "Oh my goodness, it's all of the stuff that you guys do, and you actually don't have all your own money. It's I think it's 40% of the money we send down to Westminster never makes it back to us, and Westminster has a full purse. So how is it we can do what we do, what the Scottish government can do, what is done to support people of Scotland?" And I think it's the thing about the social contract. So yes, there's always more that could be done. There's always more that should be done. But at least with one hand tied behind their back, the Scottish government is doing it. I'm often quite impressed by what seems to me to be sincere efforts to make life better for people, and I'm often dismayed and horrified when I see, I don't know, neoliberalists who call themselves conservatives standing up and shouting for people to have the bread snatched from their mouths.
Also, the other thing that the Scottish Government has been able to do is to gradually devolve welfare. So the kind of safety net which is being discussed by this report doesn't entirely exist in Scotland, but they're gradually building it. Do you see a limit to how far the Scottish Government can support that safety net, that replaces safety net, a limit under devolution? Can Scotland really not go any further in terms of introducing a universal basic income, really, until the increase of powers of the Scottish Parliament through independence, presumably? Yes. Yeah. So,
yeah, I mean,
do you yourself think that
as
UBI, is a universal basic income, a way to do that, a way to fill these holes in the safety net?
I think if it was genuine universal basic income, I think that there's a lot to be said about a proper universal basic income that actually, sort of perhaps gets paid to everybody, or maybe gets paid to everybody sort of if below a certain threshold. I think that when you look at the potential savings and I am by no means an economist, so people like Karen Van Sweden who do the Scotonomics will probably be shouting at this to the telly watching me here, so I won't go too far into it because I'm not an economist, but to me, the thought of saving all that money on not having big departments, sort of having punitive measures for people, so you're saving the money in not having layers of bureaucracy, and by by people being paid money. When you kind of think of, I once described it to somebody as being, these water features that you get in your garden. They're kind of, it's the water. You just need the water in the bowl, and then it goes up and comes down and goes up and comes down, and it just keeps moving around. And actually, that's the thing to me. That's the way I visualize the circular economy, where what you give people universal basic income, and well, the bufties that are that are stuck inside the houses, obviously with COVID things are different, but they'll go down, they'll pop down into town, and they'll have a cup of coffee, and they'll buy some presents for the grandbairns, and so you've kind of got that, and then you're actually getting benefits because people's mental health is better because they're out and about and they're meeting folk and they've got more society. You've got people are more likely to try doing entrepreneurial things because they are freed from the fear of being sort of tied to careers that they hate, that they're more likely to try taking, if you've got a 4-day week, they're more likely to spend a couple of days trying a new career. And that's one of the reasons why neoliberalists don't like that idea, is because it means that you're not going to stay in a 0 hours contract making millions for somebody else. When you know what I mean? It frees it. To me, a universal basic income done properly frees people to help them find find new joy in life.
Well, we certainly don't have time to go into that in detail just now to the economics aspects of it that you raised, which are very interesting. But as far as I know, I think that's one of the clear points of any universal, is it's actually easy to deliver. There's no forms to fill in, you just get it. So it's cheaper to deliver than means tested. Perhaps it's also time to really look at the safety net and maybe replace it with something like that, because the old safety net we're talking about really goes back to 1942, I think it was, in the Beveridge report. So maybe it's high time that was replaced by something better. However, that's again something we'll probably come back to. We're going to move on to another threat facing us, which is the SNP say that Scotland's health service is under growing threat from the UK government. Today, the SNP has warned of the growing threat to Scotland's NHS posed by Westminster's Tory government following reports of a shake-up which could see parts of the NHS dismantled and further opened up to private profit-making companies. It comes after the UK government also introduced its power grab Internal Market Act, which allows Westminster to override devolved Scottish legislation, whilst they also removed an amendment from the trade bill which would have prevented the NHS from being open to future trade deals involving US-style private health companies. They also rejected legislation to ensure that devolved competencies couldn't be overridden by Westminster. The Times reported that Tory Health Secretary Sajid Javid is exploring measures which could see academy-style hospitals where outside sponsors would be paid to run aspects of the health service. The party's Westminster Social Care spokesman, the Health and Social Care spokesperson warned that the reported plans were the latest in the Tory government's repeated attempts to erode the provision of public and not-for-profit healthcare in the UK. Commenting, the SNP shadow health and social care spokesperson, who is Martin Day MP, said, "These reports of a Tory shake-up of the NHS, including outside sponsors and academy-style hospitals, are the latest in a long list of attempts by the Tories to dismantle and undermine our vital NHS." Now, Ruth, we've reported before on the way the NHS in England has been divided up into different regions with boards which have private companies on them. And that's not been happening in Scotland. But the point is here again, the limitations of devolution. Although it's not happening in Scotland, it could be that the Internal Market Act, which is now law, forces it in Scotland, even if we don't want it. So once again, it's the limits of devolution, isn't it? And the limits of the Smith report. Remember the great, is that what this is all about? The Smith report said more devolution than ever if you vote no. And what we might end up with is the NHS being sold off.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that's been warned about for many years. One of the things I would like to see more made of is perhaps people getting the Barnett formula explained to them better, and how it is that the more that England privatises its services, then the less money there is for Scotland's health, the NHS, because it's only those budgets that are in England's public NHS, the Barnett formula allocation comes is made for Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. And yet again, it's this thing about England being used as the standard, and the rest of us sort of being given the crumbs from the table. And I think very few people really understand why the privatisation of English services has such a damaging effect on Scotland's health service. Um, and as you say, the Internal Market Act can potentially force it on us. But I suspect at the moment, with an independence referendum on the horizon, I don't think that the Tories would be so foolish as to be overt in that. I think they will do what they've done with the BBC. I remember, I think it was Noam Chomsky back in the 1980s saying that, that which the people loved and the Tories wanted to sell off, that Noam Chomsky obviously said it much better than I did, but it was along the lines of that which you love cannot be sold off, so you have to stop, you have to fall out of love with it first, and then the lion pounces. And I think that that's the thing. It's that I think the Tories have been playing the long game, and I think Blair facilitated it as well. So I remember when I worked at the BBC in the 80s and 90s, feeling a bit threatened, but actually laughing at the idea that the BBC could ever be privatised because people trusted it and loved it. And Murdoch was determined that it was going to be privatised, and just as Richard Branson was determined that the NHS would be privatised. So I think that first you erode trust, and then you sort of try and create the circumstances by which people fall out of love, and then when it goes, people neither notice nor care. And I
Yes,
think
so
that is what is being done. And I think we have to be very, very careful. But of course, in Scotland, we do still have the social contract. We do still have a functioning NHS. And it seems to me a particularly curious abomination that people who have been putting their own lives and the lives of their families and loved ones at risk to protect us over the last 2 years of pandemic are being so abused and let down by our elected leaders and by the elected leaders in London.
but as you say, when it comes to the next independence referendum, yeah, clearly that's a big vote for yes would be vote for yes to save the NHS. That's yes, that's obviously a gift that the Tories want to avoid giving the yes
Well, it's
campaign.
yeah, and the thing is that it is. I know that there are a number of people across Scotland who are doing quite a lot of work to come up with a coherent strategy to get that message across that the NHS, that we have to have Scottish independence to protect Scotland's NHS. There's a lot of work being done among the Yes movement that I am aware of to find a way to get that message out in a cogent way, because people are like frogs in the water. There's a saying that if you put a frog into a pot of boiling water, it will leap straight out. If you put it into cold water, and because I think it's their limbic system, and raise the temperature, then it will keep sitting in that water until the water boils it to death, because it is not aware of the change in temperature. And I think that perhaps COVID is giving us the effect of suddenly realizing the water is boiling around us. Perhaps people are waking up to it, but we have to make people aware of what is happening, what has changed, that the Internal Market Act has changed everything, that Brexit has changed everything, and that
Yep.
in fact our very Scottish Parliament is under risk. So it's not just our NHS is under risk. I think if I was at a meeting about 4 years ago, where I heard that that at the Scottish Tory, well, at the Tory conference, there had been a side room where they were talking about how to dismantle Holyrood. And again, I kind of had the shadow of kind of my views about, when the BBC was being threatened in the 1990s, thinking, oh, they couldn't do that. And then you go, aye, but they'll try. And I think that it will come. I think that if we don't have a vote for Scottish independence within the next 2 years, then we will see our Scottish Parliament being dismantled, and the powers that we have worked so hard for being eroded.
Yes, I see what you mean. Playing the long view and kind of salami slicing till at the end there's nothing really left to defend. Yep, that's what I would do if I was a Tory and I wanted to dismantle Scottish institutions over 10, 15 years. A bit at a time is the way to do it. So that's, of course, about the Internal Market Bill and how in many ways, really, it contradicts the promises made by the Smith Commission when Scotland voted no last time. And one of the promises was that the Scottish Government will now be made permanent. But, of course, anything can be overruled by a Westminster majority. We must move on now. A New York story which also involves us. Today we hear that New York Attorney General Letitia James took legal action to compel Donald J. Trump, Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump to appear for sworn testimony as part of the office's ongoing civil investigation into the Trump Organization's financial dealings. The motion to compel, filed last night, seeks a court order enforcing testimonial subpoenas issued to the three, Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka, as well as the production of documents held by Donald J. Trump. The papers filed make clear that each of the individuals was directly involved in one or more transactions under review. Earlier this month, the Trumps filed a motion to quash these interviews, and these papers are the Attorney General's opposition to that motion. Since moving to compel the testimony of Eric Trump in August 2020, the Office of the Attorney General, that's the OAG, says that it has collected sufficient additional evidence indicating that the Trump Organization uses fraudulent or misleading asset valuations to obtain a host of economic benefits, including loans, insurance coverage, and tax deductions. While the OAG has not yet reached a final decision regarding whether this evidence merits legal action, they say the grounds for pursuing the investigation are self-evident. The OAG filed yesterday's motion to get the necessary testimony and evidence from high-ranking corporate personnel with close involvement in the events under investigation to determine, among other things, the relevant knowledge about those events. The filing includes the Trub International Golf Club Scotland. In their investigation, the OEG says that this property, which is in Aberdeen, was purchased by the Trump Organization in 2006 for $12.6 million. In 2011, the valuation of Aberdeen used for Mr. Trump's financial statement was estimated at $75 million. That's in pounds, or $161 million in dollars. However, the OEG documents say that this valuation appears to have been based on an email prepared to provide information to Forbes magazine for a quote, and was not professionally determined. For Mr. Trump's 2014 financial statement, the Trump Organization valued the entire Aberdeen property at $435 million, in part by assuming the right to build 2,500 luxury homes on a property, despite only getting approval to build fewer than 1,500 holiday apartments and golf villas. So this is simply about finance then. We're not talking about any of Mr. Trump's political involvements. He started rallies again, but this is just about the way he keeps his books. So let me, I don't know if you made a note for those numbers there, but the most recent one is that the Trump Organization says the Aberdeen business is worth $435 million, but it was apparently on paper worth only $12 million in 2006. That's an impressive bit of business by Mr. Trump, isn't it?
It's a complete smoke and mirrors, isn't it? It's. I remember again. My memory's not great at the moment, but I'm pretty sure that the First Minister made a comment about this a year or so ago, saying that if it is worth all that money, then they would like to have another look at the amount that he's been taxed for them, because the books that he submits in Scotland would indicate that it is closer to the 2006 value rather than the value that he's saying it is now. I actually spent a very enjoyable couple of hours yesterday evening watching the latest Steve Coogan film on Netflix called Greed. It's a very thinly veiled sort of look at what's the name of that Bampa, Alan Sugar, no, Green, sorry, is it Sir Philip Green, the top shop magnate? Well, it's kind of like a cross between them all, isn't it? And it was very, very well done. It was very well done. It was kind of looking at the whole, the way in which you asset strip an organization, and it was pretty much that you sort of you sort of put it to its topmost value, and then you persuade people that they should take shares in it. So you kind of you sort of you borrow money on that business, on the value that you say it is, and then you pay yourself the dividend, and it's just and that's how
Yeah.
people get
So it's a
that's how
kind of a
people make
perpetual
money.
motion machine. It's a perpetual motion cash machine, really.
Well, it's a kind of Ponzi scheme, really,
Mhm.
isn't it? It's kind of like that. It's sort of like it's like the worst kind of pass the parcel, and that the person who, if you're holding the parcel when the music stops, and you're the sucker that gets a punch in the face. You know what I
Aye.
mean? It's it's fiscally speaking. And but what is interesting about this, and I've heard this being talked about for several years, is people in the Democrats saying this is how they got Al Capone. And I think that that's very much the case, that they've decided that that in order to get Trump, then they have to follow the money, and the well of corruption that surrounds, I suspect, most people who are really rich. I'm not entirely sure that people can get as wealthy as they say they are by entirely honest or ethical means. And I shall look forward to hubris with and Schadenfreude combined. A cold shot of Schadenfreude with my hubris.
Well, yes, a good combination. Now, talking of combinations, I noticed reading the documents from the New York Attorney General that they suggest that sometimes these properties are valued very high, as you say, when they want to use it to raise more money. But also at other times, the same properties are given very low valuations when it comes to paying taxes. So the same policy, the same property can be very expensive and very cheap, according to who is looking at the forms. So obviously that's
Schrodinger's millions.
Schrodinger's money, yeah. So it's both high and low at the same time. That's, again, a story we'll probably come back to. Now, very quickly, because, again, this is a story which is continuing and which we've looked at before and no doubt we'll be coming back to next week. Speaking in Kiev today, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that Russia could launch a new attack on Ukraine at very short notice as he met the country's president on the first leg of a new diplomatic push to avert war. Russia said tension around Ukraine was increasing and it was still waiting for a written US response to its sweeping demands for security guarantees from the West. The pessimistic statements highlighted the gulf between Washington and Moscow as Secretary Blinken gears up for a meeting with Russian Foreign Secretary Sergei Lavrov, which is on Friday, that a Russian foreign policy analyst called probably the last stop before the train wreck. Secretary Blinken told diplomats at the US Embassy in Kiev that a Russian build-up of tens of thousands of troops near the Ukraine border was taking place with no provocation, no reason. He said, "We know that there are plans in place to increase that force even more on very short notice, and that gives President Putin the capacity, also on very short notice, to take further aggressive action against Ukraine." Russia has also moved troops to Belarus for what it calls joint military exercises, giving it the option of attacking neighbouring Ukraine from the north, east and south, although it continues to deny any such intention. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Western weapons deliveries to Ukraine, military manoeuvres and NATO aircraft flights were to blame for the rising tension around Ukraine. So, as I said, Ruth, we will be covering this again on Friday after this meeting has taken place anyway, but it's... well, people have been talking this week about the drumbeat of war, and yeah, that's what's happening. So let's hope that the talks are successful or they keep talking.
Yeah, I think that that's always the case, isn't it? You want people to be talking rather than killing young men and slaughtering innocent families. Um, it's really interesting and very depressing on a number of levels. For years, the Russians have been amassing tanks at the Polish border. They've been destabilizing Europe in many ways. They've been using Syria as a pawn, playing with Turkey, using Europe, using a wave of human misery in the form of refugees as a human shield to try and destabilize a number of different nations. Um, and at the end of it all, you've got Putin, who's a small man with big ambitions to be sort of Napoleon, who never quite forgave the USSR that he loved for breaking up, um, who has held on to Russia and Russian democracy with a very, very tight fist in a variety of guises, and I suspect is probably using this to try and shore himself up. You know, the way that he puts it is he's sort of reuniting Mother Russia, and that's very popular within a certain base of his. Um, you know, I guess the more that you carry on sort of shouting out patriotic slogans and threatening war, then the more you can say to people, well, you know, you can't undermine me because this is about national pride, and you know, if I'm not here to look after Russia, then what will happen to our nation? And that kind of means that he probably gets out of a number of corruption and potential dodgy criminal charges himself, but then turn the camera back and look back at ourselves. It's exactly the same tactic that's been used by the Westminster government, who, you know, the dead cat they dragged out was sort of Chinese spying a few days ago, and now they're trying this. You know, it's. I mean, Orwell was right that it's a perpetual cycle of creating new villains to try and keep the population under control. I suspect. I
Yeah,
suspect
well,
a
I'm
lot of
afraid
this is
we're
deeply
just about
cynical.
out of time now, but yes, there certainly is one element of an appeal to nationalism, an appeal to history, and at the same time denial of democracy. And
Yeah, and an appeal for Biden because he's coming up to the midterms and he needs to look strong.
yeah, that's right. So all that's happening at the same time. As I said, the meeting with Lavrov and Blinken will be on Friday, so we'll report on that when we get it. I'm going to finish very quickly tonight, Ruth, with an update to the story last week. The Drugs Policy Minister, Angela Constance, has appointed the former chief nursing officer, the former CNO, Professor Fiona McQueen, as vice chair of the Drugs Death Task Force. Professor McQueen has experience across a range of clinical areas and is a former executive nurse director at NHS Lanarkshire and at NHS Ayrshire and Arran. She takes up the post with immediate effect and attended today's task force meeting chaired by David Strang following his appointment last week. Ms Constance, who was also in attendance, said, "This was a constructive meeting of the task force and I'm pleased to welcome David Strang and Professor Fiona McQueen to their new roles." So just in 20 seconds, Ruth, does this now give the task force the weight it needs to go ahead and establish safe consumption rooms and begin to do something about the drugs deaths?
The previous task force also had weight behind it, but perhaps wasn't so given to immediate action. I think that it's probably right to take action and then develop further evidence to back up the direction that takes. Anything we can do to stop or reduce drug deaths has to be done. I think safe consumption rooms are obviously, to me, a good way to go. And if Westminster doesn't like it, then I think that actually lives come first.
Yep, let's just do it anyway. Thank you very much, Ruth. So that's it for tonight. So it just remains for me to say once again, it's great to have you watching us, and especially to those of you who subscribe. If you want to help us to make more programmes in the future, then please look at the website. It's on the screen there, and you can sign up to be one of our supporters starting at £5 a month. And every pound we get in helps us to make more programmes and to pay the bills. Our bills are going up too. So that's it for me tonight, and from Ruth, Watson and Kirrimure. So thank you very much for joining us. It'll be Maggie tomorrow, and I'll be back on Friday. All the best. Good night. Aye, smashing
Yes.
that.